The city never really slept. At night, the skyscrapers glittered like glass monuments reaching for the stars, each one a reminder of power and ambition. At the top of one of those towers sat Richard Sterling, a billionaire whose name carried weight across continents. He was a man who had turned small ventures into empires, failures into gold, and dreams into skyscrapers. To the world, Richard was invincible. But tonight, he sat alone in his office, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at a contract that seemed to blur before his eyes. The numbers on the pages mocked him. It was supposed to be a flawless deal, a move that would cement his reputation as the man who never lost. Investors across the world were waiting for him to seal it. The media was preparing headlines praising his genius. But Richard knew something no one else did. The deal was crumbling. The projections were too high, the promises too bold, and the competitors too cunning. For the first time in years, he felt fear claw at him. The office was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. And then came the soft sound of footsteps. A woman entered quietly, carrying a cleaning cart. Her uniform was plain, her shoes worn, her hands rough from endless work. Her name was Grace. She moved with the kind of patience that came from a life of struggle, her every step quiet yet steady. To Richard, she was invisible most nights, just the maid who cleaned his empire after hours. But tonight, she was the only witness to his unraveling. Grace began dusting the shelves, her movements careful. She noticed the billionaire sitting at his desk, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. She had seen powerful men before, lawyers, bankers, executives, but Richard looked different. He looked human. For a moment she hesitated, then asked softly, "Long day, sir?" Richard glanced at her, his eyes sharp as if annoyed that a maid had dared to speak. But then he sighed, the weight too heavy to carry. "Long year," he muttered. "Maybe the longest of my life." Grace said nothing, but her silence was not empty. It was the silence of someone who understood struggle more than words could express. She wiped the glass table, her reflection shimmering next to his. Richard found himself staring at her calm expression. He almost envied it. "You wouldn't understand," he said finally, bitterness in his tone. "You've never had to hold $1 million deal in your hands and watch it fall apart." Grace paused, her cloth in hand. She turned to him, her eyes steady. "Maybe not $1 million deal," she said quietly. "But I've held my children's empty plates in my hands and wondered how to fill them. That feels like the end of the world, too." Her words struck him harder than he expected. For a moment, Richard Sterling, the man who thought only in billions, saw his problems differently. He quickly looked away, ashamed of the weakness she had glimpsed in him. The night dragged on. Richard tried to focus on the papers again, but Grace's words echoed in his mind. By the time she left, the city was already beginning to glow with dawn. Tomorrow was the day of the big meeting, the moment when the world would either bow to his brilliance again or witness his fall. He told himself he was ready, but deep down, he knew he was walking into a storm. The next morning, the grand conference. Hall of the Imperial Hotel buzzed with anticipation. The richest men and women from across the globe had gathered. Reporters lined the walls, cameras flashing, ready to capture history. The chandeliers above sparkled like jewels, reflecting the faces of those who controlled empires, and in the center of it all was Richard Sterling. He entered the hall dressed in a flawless suit, his expression confident, his stride measured. But inside, his heart pounded. His reputation was on the line. The contract lay in his briefcase like a ticking bomb. He looked at the investors across the table, men with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. They were not here to be impressed. They were here to test him. Richard began his presentation, his voice strong at first. He spoke of expansion, of profits, of visions that stretched across continents. Graphs appeared on the giant screen behind him, numbers dancing in bright colors. For a while, the room seemed impressed, but then came the questions. "Your projections are too ambitious, Mr. Sterling," one investor said. "What concrete evidence do you have?" Richard hesitated. He gave an answer, but it lacked the fire of certainty. Another investor pressed, harder. Another followed. Soon the room was filled with skeptical eyes and doubtful murmurs. Richard's confidence cracked. Sweat gathered on his forehead. The cameras captured it all. Reporters scribbled furiously. The man who had never lost was faltering. And back at the skyscraper, Grace was mopping the marble floor in the lobby. The television played the live broadcast of the meeting. She glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she saw Richard stumble through his answers. The commentators whispered, "Is this the end of Sterling's reign?" Grace shook her head softly. She whispered almost to herself, "Pride doesn't close deals, honesty does." She went back to her work, unaware that soon her life and Richard's would collide in a way neither of them could have imagined. Because sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes the maid no one notices holds the key to saving the empire of the man everyone watches. The silence inside the conference hall grew heavier with every passing second. Richard could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes drilling into him. He tried to keep his composure, but the investors were predators, and they had caught the scent of fear. One of them leaned forward, tapping the table with a pen. "Your empire has always stood on confidence, Mr. Sterling. But confidence without substance is just noise." The words struck like a dagger. Richard opened his mouth to reply, but the sound that came out was thin, almost hollow. He spoke of strategies, of future markets, of possibilities. But he could hear it himself. The certainty was gone. His words no longer commanded. They begged. Across the hall, a Japanese chairman with silver hair slowly closed the file in front of him. "We appreciate your time," he said coldly, "but we cannot invest in castles built on clouds." The other investors exchanged silent nods. One by one they gathered their papers. Chairs scraped against the floor. Cameras flashed as they stood, leaving Richard Sterling frozen in his seat. His assistant whispered something in his ear, but he could not hear. The chandelier above seemed to sway, the light blinding. For the first time in his career, Richard Sterling had failed. He sat there long after the hall had emptied, his fists clenched, his chest burning with humiliation. Outside, the reporters wasted no time. Headlines were already racing across screens. "Sterling stumbles. Is this the end of an era?" Richard finally rose, his steps unsteady, and walked out of the hotel with the weight of a kingdom collapsing on his shoulders. Back in the skyscraper, Grace watched the news replay on the lobby television. She saw Richard's face, pale, broken, so different from the arrogant man who had once mocked her with a careless remark. She paused, her mop still in her hand. A part of her felt sorry for him. Not because he was rich or because he lost millions, but because she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who had been stripped of dignity, left standing bare in front of the world. She had known that look too well. That evening, Richard returned to his office. He shut the door, collapsed into his chair, and buried his face in his hands. The city outside sparkled as if mocking him. The empire he had built stone by stone now felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He didn't hear Grace enter. She was back for her night shift, pushing her cart into the office, humming a quiet tune to herself. She froze when she saw him, sitting there, not in control, but broken. She had seen broken men before, but seeing Richard like that shook her. "Rough day?" she asked gently. Richard lifted his head sharply, anger flashing in his eyes. "Do you enjoy it?" he snapped. "Watching me fall? Does it make you feel better?" Grace didn't flinch. She had been shouted at before, insulted before. Life had thrown far worse at her. She simply shook her head. "No, sir. But I know what it feels like to fall. And I know what it feels like to get back up." Her words echoed in the quiet office. Richard wanted to laugh at the absurdity. A maid telling him about falling and rising. What could she possibly know about the stakes of millions, of global markets? But there was something in her tone, something steady and unshaken, that pierced through his pride. He stared at her. This woman in worn shoes and a plain uniform, and for the first time he wondered. Maybe there was a strength in her he had never seen before. Grace went back to wiping the shelves, humming again, as if she had said nothing extraordinary. But her words stayed with him, clinging like shadows he could not shake. That night, Richard did not sleep. He paced his office, replaying every moment of his failure, and in between those memories he heard Grace's calm voice. "I know what it feels like to fall, and I know what it feels like to get back up." It was a strange thing. The world's greatest advisors could not lift his spirit, but the maid who cleaned his desk had left him with a seed of thought he could not ignore. The storm had only just begun, and neither Richard nor Grace knew that soon their worlds would collide in ways that would leave the city breathless, because sometimes the greatest rescue does not come from wealth or power. Sometimes it comes from the quiet strength of those the world refuses to see. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, every major newspaper carried the same headline. "Sterling stumbles." The words were printed in bold black letters, repeated across screens, whispered in cafes, and dissected on business channels. For years, Richard Sterling had been a symbol of dominance, a man untouchable, but now the world had finally seen a crack, and the world loved nothing more than to watch a giant fall. Richard sat in his office, the blinds closed, the television muted. His assistant had left a pile of messages on his desk, calls from board members, lawyers, and investors. He hadn't answered a single one. Every voice would demand an explanation he did not have. Every call would remind him of the failure he wanted to forget. He poured himself a drink, but even the burn of whiskey did not dull the humiliation. The conference replayed in his mind again and again, the doubt in their eyes, the cold words, the sound of chairs scraping the floor as they left. He had been left alone under that chandelier, abandoned by the same men who once fought for a seat at his table. In the corner of the room, Grace quietly arranged her cleaning supplies. She did not speak. She had learned long ago that silence could sometimes be the greatest comfort. But as she dusted the shelves, she caught a glimpse of him, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped, and her heart stirred with something she could not name. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice hoarse. "Do you know what it feels like to be laughed at by the world?" Grace turned to him. She did not hesitate. "Yes." He frowned, surprised. "You? The world doesn't even see you." She met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Exactly. To be unseen is another kind of laughter, a quieter one. People walk past me as if I don't exist. They smile at the polished floors but never at the woman who scrubbed them. That's the world's laughter, too." Her words silenced him. Richard had expected pity or empty comfort, not a truth so sharp. He looked away, ashamed. She returned to her work as if nothing had happened, but her words had carved themselves into him. That night, while Richard wrestled with his demons, Grace returned to her small apartment. The building was old, its walls peeling, the hallways echoing with the sounds of too many lives crammed together. She unlocked the door and was greeted by the laughter of her 2 children. Her son ran to her, his clothes patched, his eyes bright. Her daughter hugged her waist tightly. "Mom, are you tired?" the girl asked softly. Grace smiled, kissing her forehead. A little, but seeing you both makes the day worth it. They sat down to dinner, a simple meal of rice and beans. Grace listened to her children chatter about school, about dreams of becoming doctors and teachers. She nodded, encouraging them, even though a part of her wondered how she would pay for their books next month. But she never let them see her worry. Strength was the only gift she could give them. Later that night, after putting them to bed, Grace sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Richard Sterling sat in his tower of glass and steel, drowning in failure. She thought about his question, about being laughed at by the world. She thought about how pain connected people in ways money never could. The next morning, Richard forced himself to face the board of directors. The meeting room was filled with stern faces, the kind that once bowed to him but now carried only disappointment. "You embarrassed us," one of them said sharply. "You jeopardized billions," another added. Richard clenched his jaw. He wanted to defend himself, but the words felt hollow. Every excuse sounded weak even in his own mind. He realized something he had never admitted before. He did not have the answers. The meeting ended with threats of resignation, whispers of replacement, and a chilling warning. If he didn't fix things fast, his empire would crumble. Back in Upper T, his office, Richard collapsed into his chair, feeling more trapped than ever. That was when Grace entered again, her cart squeaking softly on the polished floor. She hummed a tune as she worked, a melody so gentle it almost cut through his storm. "What is that song?" he asked suddenly. She looked up, surprised. "An old hymn my mother used to sing. She said it helped her believe that no storm lasts forever." Richard laughed bitterly. "Storms destroy everything in their path." Grace shook her head. "Not always. Sometimes they wash the dirt away and show the ground underneath." Her words lingered in the air. Richard wanted to dismiss them, but something about her certainty unsettled him. How could a maid, a woman with nothing, speak with such conviction when he, with everything, felt hollow? He watched her as she continued to work. She moved with a quiet dignity, as if every task mattered, as if every corner she cleaned was a statement of resilience. He wondered what it would be like to carry such strength. The days passed, and the pressure mounted. Reporters hounded him. Investors threatened lawsuits. Employees whispered about the fall of a king. Richard found himself spiraling deeper into despair, and yet, every night Grace appeared, steady, calm, untouchable. She did not solve his problems. She did not offer advice. But her presence was an anchor in a sea that threatened to drown him. And slowly, without realizing it, Richard began to listen more, to watch more, to wonder if perhaps the key to saving himself lay not in the boardroom, but in the wisdom of someone the world refused to see. Because sometimes the greatest truths are spoken in whispers, not shouts. And Richard Sterling was beginning to hear them. The storm did not pass. It only grew darker. Within a week, Richard Sterling became the center of ridicule. Talk shows joked about his arrogance. Headlines read like obituaries of his empire. The billionaire who couldn't deliver. Rival companies seized the chance, circling like vultures around a wounded lion. Stocks of his company plummeted. What had once been seen as unshakable now looked fragile. One evening, Richard stepped into a restaurant he used to frequent. Once, people would stand when he entered, eager to shake his hand, desperate to be seen near him. But that night, the atmosphere changed. Conversations hushed, but not out of respect. Smirks spread across faces. He heard whispers. "That's him, the man who failed." A group of young businessmen at the bar chuckled openly. "Guess money can't buy intelligence?" Richard clenched his fists. He wanted to shout, to remind them who he was. But the truth was louder than his pride. He left the restaurant without eating, his steps heavy with humiliation. Back in his skyscraper office, he poured himself another drink, but it no longer gave him comfort. He stared at the city through the glass walls, watching the lights blur as tears threatened to fall. For years he had believed himself untouchable, but tonight he was just a man stripped bare. That was when Grace entered again, her cart squeaking softly, her eyes instantly catching the sight of him slumped at the window. She said nothing at first, moving quietly as always, but she felt his pain in the silence. Finally, she spoke. "Do you know what my son asked me today?" Richard turned his head slowly, his expression blank. "He asked me why I work so much," Grace continued, her voice soft but steady. "I told him because I want him to dream. I want him to know that no matter how small we are, we can still rise. Even if the world laughs," Richard scoffed, though it lacked venom. "And do you believe that? Has the world ever let you rise?" Grace met his eyes. "I rise every day I wake up and refuse to give up. I rise every time I put food on my children's table, even if it's just bread. Rising doesn't mean winning in the eyes of others. It means refusing to stay down in your own." Her words hit him harder than any insult. He stared at her, struggling to understand how a woman with nothing could speak with more power than a man with everything. For the first time, Richard asked her a question without sarcasm. "Where did you learn to be so strong?" Grace paused, her hand tightening around the cloth she held. For a moment, her eyes clouded with memories. "Life taught me," she whispered. "When my husband left, I had nothing. 2 children, no money, no family to help. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, mornings I woke not knowing how to go on. But then I realized no one was coming to save me. I had to save myself. And once I learned that, nothing the world threw at me could break me again." Richard was silent. His empire was crumbling, but in front of him stood a woman who had survived storms he could not imagine. And she did it without millions, without headlines, without armies of advisors. The next day brought another blow. A rival company held a press conference, announcing that they had taken over one of Sterling's most valuable contracts. Reporters compared Richard to a sinking ship. His phone rang endlessly, but he stopped answering. His world was collapsing, piece by piece. That evening, he sat in his office again, broken. Grace entered, as always. She glanced at him, then at the untouched food on his desk. "You need to eat," she said simply. "I need to disappear," he muttered. Grace sat down, her cloth, and stood straighter than usual. "No, you need to fight. You are not defeated until you decide to stop trying." Richard looked at her, anger flashing in his eyes. "Fight? Against what? The world has already judged me. They've closed the doors." Grace stepped closer, her voice firmer now. "Then find another door, or build one yourself. Don't let pride blind you. Sometimes the solution is simpler than the numbers you bury yourself in." Her tone startled him. This was not just a maid speaking. This was someone who had lived through fire and learned to walk through it. He shook his head, exhausted. "You make it sound so easy." Grace's eyes softened. "It's never easy, but it is possible." For the first time in days, Richard felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. He studied her carefully. A woman who had no business in boardrooms, no education in high finance, and yet she carried a clarity he had been missing. He wondered, could it be possible that she saw something he didn't? That night, long after Grace left, Richard sat alone with his thoughts. Her words echoed in his mind. Find another door, or build one yourself. He looked at the failed contract. On his desk, then at the skyline outside. For years he had thought in billions, in towering projects, in grand visions. But perhaps the answer lay in something smaller, something simpler, something honest. For the first time, Richard began to consider listening not to the experts, not to the advisors, but to the maid whose words carried more truth than all their reports combined. The fall of Richard Sterling was not complete yet, but in the quiet strength of grace, the first seed of redemption had been planted, because sometimes the world's greatest empires are saved not by power, but by the wisdom of those no one bothers to notice. The empire was hanging by a thread. Richard Sterling sat in his boardroom the next morning. His senior executives gathered around the long, polished table. Their voices overlapped. Numbers, graphs, strategies, excuses. The air was thick with tension. "We've lost 3 major investors this week," one said. "Our stocks are bleeding," another added. "If we don't secure a new deal within 10 days, the collapse will be irreversible," warned the CFO. Richard pressed his fingers to his temples, his mind throbbing. For years he had commanded these rooms with authority. Today, he was drowning in the chaos of voices. Nothing made sense anymore. That was when the door creaked. Grace, carrying her cleaning supplies, paused at the sight of the crowded room. Her instinct told her to retreat, but Richard's eyes met hers for a fleeting second. Something inside him shifted. "Leave us," Richard suddenly ordered his executives. They stared in disbelief. "But, sir," "I said leave," Richard repeated, his voice sharper this time. Murmurs filled the room as the executives reluctantly filed out, glaring at Grace as though she had intruded on sacred ground. The door shut, and silence fell. Richard leaned back, exhaustion etched across his face. "I can't hear them anymore," he muttered. "All their words, just noise. Empty noise." Grace hesitated, then stepped inside. "Maybe that's the, problem," she said softly. "Too many people talking. Not enough people listening." Richard gave a bitter laugh. "Listening? To who? To you?" Grace met his eyes calmly. "Why not?" Her boldness startled him. This was the maid, the invisible woman of his empire. Yet here she was, standing tall, unafraid. "All right," Richard said finally, curiosity lacing his frustration. "Tell me then, what do you see that I don't?" Grace set her cleaning cloth aside and walked closer to the window overlooking the city. "You're chasing numbers," she began. "Charts, graphs, projections. But people don't invest in numbers, Mr. Sterling. They invest in trust. They invest in vision they can feel." Richard frowned, intrigued despite himself. "Do you know why your deal failed?" Grace continued. "Because you talked to them like they were machines, cold statistics, empty promises. You forgot that behind every dollar is a human heart that wants to believe. You lost the story." Richard's breath caught. The story. His advisors had hammered facts and figures into his presentations, but none had spoken of story. Yet here was a maid, weaving words that cut through his fog like light. "You think they care about profit margins?" "No," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "They care about meaning, about purpose, about being part of something bigger than themselves. And you forgot to give them that." Her words struck like thunder. Richard leaned forward, his mind racing. She was right. He had stood in that grand hall armed with data, but empty of soul. And the investors had felt it. For the first time in weeks, Richard felt clarity. He looked at Grace. Truly looked at her. Not as a maid, but as a mind sharper than the advisors he had paid millions. "Grace," he said slowly, "what would you have done?" She hesitated, then stepped closer to the table. "I would have told them a story. About rebuilding cities, about lives changed, about hope created. I would have spoken from the heart, not the wallet." Because even billionaires need to believe in something more than money. Richard sat back, stunned. The simplicity, the truth, it was undeniable. "You think you can fix what I broke?" he asked quietly. Grace's eyes didn't waver. "I think I can help, but only if you're willing to listen." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Richard's pride battled with his desperation. Finally, he nodded. "Show me." That night, the office transformed. Instead of graphs and charts, the walls filled with notes Grace scribbled on scrap paper. She spoke with conviction, painting images of futures investors could feel. She talked about children who would benefit from schools Richard's projects could fund, communities that could rise from the dust of forgotten towns. Richard listened, sometimes skeptical, sometimes amazed. "You speak like you've been in those boardrooms all your life," Richard said at one point. Grace smiled faintly. "No, sir. I speak like I've lived the life those boardrooms forget." Her words pierced, deeper than she knew. Richard realized his empire had always been built from the top down. Grace was showing him how to build it from the ground up. Day by day, Richard changed. He began to echo Grace's ideas, shaping them with his knowledge of markets. Together, they crafted a new strategy, not of greed, but of purpose. The Billionaire and the Maid, worlds apart, now partners in an unspoken alliance. But the world wasn't ready for it yet. One evening, as they worked late, Richard's assistant barged in. His eyes widened at the sight of Grace standing at the head of the table, speaking with authority. "What is this?" he demanded. "She's a cleaner, and you're letting her dictate our future." Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced at Grace, who stood still, unshaken. Then he turned back to his assistant. "She's the only one making sense right now. If you can't accept that, you can leave." The assistant's mouth fell open. "You're risking everything for the advice of a maid." Richard's voice was steady. "No, I'm saving everything because I finally started listening." The assistant stormed out, slamming the door. Grace exhaled slowly, her hands trembling just slightly. But Richard's eyes held a spark she had not seen before, a fire rekindled. The city was waiting. The investors were circling. Richard Sterling had fallen. But with Grace by his side, the stage was being set for something no one expected. Because sometimes salvation comes not from power, but from the voices the world silences, and soon the Maid would prove it to them all. The day of reckoning arrived. The grand hall was alive with flashing cameras and murmuring voices. Investors, journalists, analysts, and critics filled the seats, all waiting for one thing: Richard Sterling's final attempt to save his empire. If he failed here, Sterling Global would crumble. The city knew it. The world knew it. And perhaps deep down, Richard himself knew it. He stood behind the curtain, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. His reflection in the mirror no longer looked like the invincible billionaire who once commanded nations. It looked like a man on the edge, stripped of his pride, clinging to one last chance. Behind him, Grace quietly entered, holding nothing but a notebook. No expensive suit, no shining jewelry, just her plain uniform and calm presence. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. Richard turned, his eyes weary but determined. "They came for me, Grace, not for you." Grace shook her head. "No, they came for the truth. And the truth is, they'll only believe it if you speak with your heart. Not numbers, not noise, heart." Her words steadied him. For weeks she had been the anchor he didn't know he needed. Now he nodded, taking a deep breath. "Stay close," he whispered. Moments later, Richard walked onto the stage. The hall erupted in murmurs. Cameras flashed. The world leaned forward. He began with the familiar, the numbers, the charts, the projections. But as he spoke, he saw the same blank stares, the same coldness he had faced before. His throat tightened. His words faltered. The silence in the room was deafening. And then, from the front row, Grace's voice rose. Clear, calm, steady. "Tell them about the children, Mr. Sterling." The audience turned in surprise. A maid's voice in the hall of billionaires? Some laughed, some frowned. But Richard's heart steadied. He met Grace's eyes, and for the first time, he followed her lead. He put down the papers. He stepped away from the podium. And he began to speak, not as a billionaire, but as a man. He told them about the forgotten towns where his new projects would bring jobs, about the schools that would rise from empty lots, about the lives that would change, not because of profits, but because of purpose. His voice shook at first, but with every word, strength returned. The investors leaned forward. Journalists stopped typing and started listening. The room was no longer filled with charts. It was filled with vision. Grace watched from the shadows, tears welling in her eyes. The story she had planted was blooming in the heart of a man who once mocked her shoes. And now, the world was listening. When Richard finished, silence hung heavy for a moment, and then, one by one, the investors began to clap. The sound grew, echoing through the hall, until it became a roar. Richard's chest tightened, emotion flooding him. He had done it, or rather they had done it. But the moment was not complete yet. One investor, a powerful woman with sharp eyes, stood and raised her hand. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "your words are moving. But tell us, where did this sudden clarity come from? Who taught you to speak like this?" The hall fell silent again. All eyes turned to Richard. He glanced at Grace, standing quietly at the side of the stage. For a moment, he hesitated. Admitting the truth would shock them all. It might even ruin him. But then he remembered the words Grace had told him on the night of his failure. "I know what it feels like to fall, and I know what it feels like to get back up." Richard stepped aside and extended his hand toward Grace. "It came from her," he said firmly. "The one the world doesn't see, the one this building calls a maid. But to me, she has been the voice of reason, the voice of truth." Gasps filled the hall. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Investors turned, stunned, as Grace walked slowly onto the stage. Her hands trembled, but Richard's steady gaze gave her strength. She took the microphone. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I'm not a businesswoman," Grace began. "I don't know about markets or shares, but I know about people. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be told your words don't matter. And I also know this. Every empire falls when it forgets the people at its foundation." Her words sliced through the hall like lightning. "Money is only paper," she continued. "But trust is life. And if you choose to invest in Mr. Sterling today, you're not investing in his company. You're investing in a vision where wealth builds, not destroys, where power lifts, not crushes. That's the future he's offering you. That's the future you can be part of." The silence that followed was unlike any before. This was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of hearts struck by truth. And then applause erupted, louder than before, louder than Richard had ever heard in his life. Investors stood to their feet, clapping, cheering. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed furiously. The maid who once mopped floors had just turned the tide of an empire. By the end of the night, contracts were signed. Investments poured in. Sterling Global was saved, not by charts or numbers, but by the courage of a woman the world had overlooked. Backstage, Richard turned to Grace, emotion choking his voice. "You saved me," he whispered. Grace shook her head with a gentle smile. "No, Mr. Sterling, you just finally listened." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of the night sinking in. Richard realized he had not only regained his empire, he had gained something far greater: humility, humanity, and a friend he never expected. The next morning, headlines flooded every screen. Billionaire saved by Maid's words, a story that shook the business world. Grace became a quiet legend. She returned to her uniform, her duties, her cart. But those who once overlooked her now greeted her with respect. Some even stopped to listen. And Richard Sterling? He never forgot. His empire stood taller than ever, not because of profits, but because of purpose. And whenever he faced a decision, he remembered the maid who had shown him the truth, that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power, because in the end, it wasn't the billionaire who saved the empire. It was the maid who taught him how.